started, I guess, because we have a tight out. Today is the this whole session on The Wire is being co-sponsored by a number of schools here on campus, as Eileen, I'm sure, already informed some of you. And today, this weekend, the journalism school is having an open house for its next year's class, for the class that was just admitted. And we have a tight out, so I don't want to. I want to give us as much time as we can to sort of talk. So, welcome to the panel on Immersion Journalism. It started as immersive journalism, which was what it was called probably 12 or 15 years ago. But in the interim, someone invented virtual reality, and now virtual reality, when practiced as journalism, is called immersive journalism. So this panel became Immersion Journalism. And because we are journalists and not academics, we are not going to stand at the podium and read papers, because none of us have PhDs and we're all intimidated by the idea of standing at the podium and reading papers. So we're going to have a discussion and I'm really honored and humbled to be here with all of the women on this panel, are award-winning journalists who've spent significant amount of time working in the field. And I guess I'll go Andrea to my right, Andrea Elliot, who is a graduate actually of Columbia Journalism School and a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, did a series on Dasani. You know, I should have had that up. I should have pulled it up on the Times website, which I was telling, some of you may remember, this was the homeless family in New York, if you live here in New York, that ran in the Times 2 years ago, about. And next to her is a MacArthur Fellow, Adrian Nicole LeBlanc, who wrote A Random Family. She was talking with us about sort of doing the work that we do without ever sort of having the professional, I guess, whatever's that call you.
Shelter.
The professional shelter, yeah. Well, I do that work too. I'm an independent filmmaker, so it's a whole other thing. And then at the end, Andrea K, McDaniels, who writes for the Baltimore Sun, and did a wonderful series on called Collateral Damage. The Wire and its predecessor, The Corner, which was what drew me to the work of David Simon. The Corner was first a book. Simon moved into an apartment above a corner at, oh God, it just flew out of my head, Fayette and Monroe in West Baltimore, which is where he first observed and came to know the characters that ultimately he recreated and reimagined for The Wire. The Corner in its own was a very successful book and then became a 3-part series for HBO that won a National Emmy, a Writers Guild Award for Best Writing, and sort of led HBO to say, okay, maybe we'll take a chance on this thing called The Wire. But this work begins very often with journalists immersing themselves. And when we say immersing, what we're talking about is you basically live in the community where the characters are living. And we refer to them as character. In print journalism, they very often call them subjects, and I've long ago ceased using that word. They're my co-creators in helping me tell the story. So we're going to talk a bit about what leads you to do this, because you're basically taken out of everything that you sort of know and hold familiar, and you're spending time in another environment, and it's a commitment not only of resources, but it's a psychic commitment. So I thought I'd start. Adrian, you spent 12 years writing A Random Family. You went through 2 agents, 2 publishers, and 5 editors. Do I remember this right, in order to write the book?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you pull it closer, yeah.
I can't remember, but a lot of canceled contracts, and
right.
Then it was initially contracted as a different story than the story it became, but then I couldn't find a publisher for it.
Right.
Yeah, it had a long orphaned history as a product.
Right. But it started as a news story on Boy George.
It started as a story about a young kid who was dealing drugs at a time in the drug war where they were applying the law that had been used to bring in some mob mob-related criminals by using underlings to sort of work your way up into a criminal enterprise to get to the top guys who had power. So that had been somewhat effective with the mob, and they were now beginning to apply it to drug dealers because they were able to arrest low-level offenders quite easily. So they were basically beginning to use informants and flipping people and, to report on the people that hired them. So this young man, Boy George Rivera, was a very young man who was dealing drugs, and he was the first person, I think, in New York State to be prosecuted under the Kingpin law, and that's where the story began. But it then became a story about a family involved in the drug trade directly or indirectly. So they were very interested in the story of his criminal enterprise, but they weren't so interested in the story of a family.
And so what made you stick with it through all those years? What was your inspiration?
Well, I think I just had a deep desire and an overwhelming need to be present in the environments that where the story took place. So at the time, I probably would have given you a lot of answers that had to do with finding out things that were different than those that were usually reported on. There's a lot of demonization of kids dealing drugs and a lot of discussion about how much money they were making. And in fact, what I was finding were they weren't making that much money. And they were just kids trying to figure out their lives. And those reasons are very valid. But I think now I look back and I think I had my own very deep psychic need to be there. I mean, there's a psychic cost, but I also think I had a very deep personal need to be in environments of a particular kind of chaos and urgency that had to do with my own personal history, really.
Why do you think these stories of pathology are so gripping?
Well, I don't see these as stories of pathology, which is partly why I want to write about them, because the pathologization of them is really... I mean, I don't know. I feel like we all can answer.
We all have a different answer to this,
but I don't see them as pathology. So I think, and that's where my personal, I think it's the self-blame of poverty. I mean, the fact that so many Americans blame themselves for their poverty is something I have a deep rage about, and I think I'm very interested in disrupting that.
Andrea, Elliot, what led you, when you started Dasani, The Invisible Child, what led you to want to do that story?
So I would love to start just by saying that I think as journalists, we are very curious creatures, and we like to go into other worlds, and the things that lead us there can be very random. And in this case, I think Adrian's book was a big part of it. Reading that book. And also reading well before that Alex Koutlowitz's There Are No Children Here in 1986. And then feeling all those years later that the story was still there, that these kids were still on the train and on the street, and their stories needed to be told. And just feeling like the backdrop historically hadn't changed. The backdrop had changed, in each one of these contexts, but the problem remained. And so I think that's the kind of intellectual answer, but it's so interesting to listen to Adrian speak about this, because I think there is a very personal thing that happens with some journalists. Not all like to do immersion. Immersion's really not for everyone. But there are some, I would consider us a kind of special breed, people who, I guess, in some way want to get inside the heads of our subjects so much that the only way to do that is to be around them day in, day out, day in, day out. And that may be an impossible goal at the end of the day, but the pursuit of that, of just complete immersion so that you start to feel like you know what it is to be them, that pursuit is driven by the work that excites me, that I read, like Random Family, things that transport the reader deep inside something that at first glance when you first look at The Wire, you might say this too is pathology, but then when you go inside, you see that you're actually completely connecting with these characters that are from these very different walks, and that's so exciting to me. And I think that there's a kind of creative, esoteric aspect to it that has nothing to do with these intellectual answers, that it's just about wanting to cross over. And I'm the daughter of an immigrant, and I grew up never feeling fully like one thing. And inside the Chilean exile community, my mother's from Chile, and everybody got kicked out in the dictatorship, and we grew up here. And my dad's American, and so I think I've always been drawn to otherness, and spent many years writing about Islam in America. So the people on the margins, on the margins of what? People love to talk about marginalized communities, but on the margins of what, in relation to whom? I'm writing for the Times, and so we have a readership that tends to be pretty educated, and it's a subset. And so I think my own kind of personal goal in these stories has been to try to get those readers to kind of feel like they are inside this kid's head. They are this kid in a sense, and that's really hard to do. But
Yeah, that series was serialized, actually, and then speaking of serialization of narrative in the Times, and I recommend it to you. Andrea McDaniels, what led you to want to do the work on collateral damage, which looked at what happens to the families and the loved ones of those who are killed on the streets of Baltimore?
Sure.
You might want to pull the mic closer to you.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm a health and medicine reporter, and I kept seeing these health disparity reports that came out every year that listed violence as one of the top health disparities, in the city, top 5 every year. So in seeing those reports, I was like, well, what is the untold story of violence? We cover violence a lot in Baltimore, but we cover it from a very one-dimensional point of view. And looking at those reports, I was like, well, who are we forgetting? Who are we not telling the stories about when we talk about violence and the impact? And that's what led me to, seeking the families that were affected in violence more than just people going to jail, but the grief that mothers feel when their sons die. Even if their sons are criminals, they're still their sons. They still gave birth to them. They still feel the grief. Why are these kids acting out? You hear gunshots outside your window every night. Of course you're going to act out. The teachers, daycare center owners who are dealing with kids as young as 2 who are acting out because they don't know how to control their emotions because of what they see in their community. So I went into journalism, as an African-American woman because I wanted to see more of myself in the paper. So I've always been drawn to telling the untold story, I thought, and this was kind of how I was led to that as well.
Yeah, your series begins with a story of a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old who picks up a chair and throws it against the wall.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about the science that you uncovered? I know we've talked about humanities and sociology, but there's also a biology and a chemistry that underlies all of this. Could you just sort of talk about that a little bit?
Right. So when you have large amounts of stress in your body, your brain, certain complex parts of your brain don't develop correctly. So then it leads you to have problems controlling your emotions, et cetera. And that story at that daycare center, it's called Little Flowers. It's in West Baltimore. That story is not unusual. These teachers were dealing with that day in and day out. And some of the teachers even admitted some days, I just want to tell the kid to be quiet, why do you have to act out? But then they have to, step back and say, I know that these are kids that are going through a lot, and I have to be here, to help them. And that daycare center teacher even sent her teachers to trauma training so they could better understand how do we deal, with children like that who are so innocent. We're born, with a clean slate. So it's after we get into this environment that, it affects us.
Yeah, and so was it a hard sell to your editors?
It was a bit of a hard sell because it's hard to explain. It's such a huge topic, and there's so many ways you could go, so it's hard to narrow down the stories. But I think after I talked to real people and was able to tell the stories to through real people, what's happening to this specific 2-year-old, what's happening to this particular daycare center teacher, then the editors better understood. Because I wrote a draft first, and they were going to run it, but they weren't overly excited. But then after they read the draft, the top editor better understood, and he was like, oh, this is new stuff. This is stuff that I never thought about. It's stuff that I think I know, you think you know about it, but until you actually see it and read about it on paper, then you get more of it, and that's when it turned into a bigger project.
A bigger story, which was actually rewarded the healthcare journalists and the science writers?
Yes.
Science, National Advancement of Science, both, so I
Yeah.
highly recommended. How does this immersion that you do in the neighborhoods complicate the traditional roles of journalists and subject? Because normally we walk in, we say everything you say is going to be on the record. I'm not going to pay you. But yet it's really a clash of two cultures. Can you each talk about the culture clash and how you negotiate it?
I'd love to jump in first on this one, only because I've had a bit of a progression, and it's been, and it might, we were talking a little bit earlier before this, because Adrian's an independent journalist, and this was a book project. I came into the subject as an employee of the New York Times with a very somewhat arcane, strict, long set of rules that we have drilled into our minds as reporters that are based on very well-considered facets of, the ethics of journalism, and that have come about from, a lot of these rules, I think, came out of reporting even in the 1950s and 60s, when it was common for you as a City Hall reporter to be out on the golf range, maybe somewhere with your sources. And so it's things like, you can always pay for the food for both of you, but you can't allow them to pay, and things like that. There can never be, obviously, money cannot change hands, but you can pay for your sources to go out to eat. So what happens when you take, let's look at that rule specifically, and you apply it to this context where the entire environment is defined by the lack of food, for instance, and lack of material things. It's sort of an awkward fit. It's like, well, I can spring for this meal at McDonald's in exchange, and there's no transaction here. I just want your story. I'm not paying you for your story. And your story, by the way, has to do very squarely with the fact that you're hungry right now. And yeah, we can go out to eat. We can talk about that. It was just really, really complicated. And I kind of, there's another way in which it was complicated, which is that I think even up until this project, and I had been, I think I'd been wrestling with this already in my other work, because I'd done projects for years at that point at the Times. The sort of traditional role of journalist, the hat you wear as journalist, and then the hat that your subject wears as source, as subject, and that those hats are clear, and that there's this line between you two. I think that is a very understandably well-protected set of roles, that you can't be quote-unquote friends, right, with your sources. We need to protect the integrity of our work. And that has remained front and center, obviously, in my thinking, but it's just, it's a hell of a lot more complicated, A, when you enter children into the picture, and B, when you're immersed in people's lives. And I don't know, I've just had a lot of struggling with knowing what I kind of came around, because there's so much to say, I feel like I should probably shut up, and I'll say one really final thing about it. What I came around to seeing was, in the beginning, perhaps years ago, I would consider my ability to connect emotionally with my subjects as a burden, as something to be careful of, wary of, watchful of, and potentially something that might contaminate my work. And I take a very different position now. I think that kind of connection is not only okay, it's essential. It's what, for me, leads to immediacy. It frees me as a writer. It makes me able to at least try to lift my subjects off the page in a way and hold them up into the light. It's so important to connect. So with this series, I had a lot of really tough rides home on the train when I would accumulate what I called my train notes. And a lot of that stuff that I wrote, these were after, stints with the family. Sometimes just an hour, sometimes it was 10 hours. And I'd be on the train home, and I'd just dump a lot of thoughts. And some of that language went directly into the series unedited. It's just like, because it was right there. I
So
think
were you going back and forth? Were you going from your home?
I was going
Manhattan
from
to-
it was 40 minutes. And I was living, I live in Harlem, but, so.
And they lived in Brooklyn,
They
just
live in
across
Brooklyn,
you.
yeah. But I think just getting them, first of all, we're human, so we're going to feel stuff. And I guess, so you have to do something with that. And so it'd be inhumane not to shed tears and not to get really down about stuff. And I guess when those things happened in the beginning, my instinct was like to tell myself, this is like my kind of guilty Catholic upbringing, but like, put those feelings aside, because if it's sad to watch, how much sadder is it to be them, so like you don't really get to own that. Like your job here is as a scribe or whatever, vessel for the story, and that's really naive, actually, we do become very invested in the lives of our subjects and connected, and their triumphs and their downfalls are deeply felt, I think, by us. So it's really hard.
Andrea, did you, I don't know how to separate you two, let's call you Baltimore Andrea.
Yeah.
Did you spent a year doing a series primarily about children, or you got their mothers involved as well. Did you find also that conflict is what New York Andrea
Yes, because
says
you want to, you want to be a journalist, but you're also human. And for some reason, I was very, very concerned about exploiting these families. I didn't want the families to feel exploited, so I took extra efforts to remind them, like throughout the process, that this is going in the paper, this is, what I'm working on, more so than I would say a politician or a business person that I would cover. So I made sure I was upfront the whole time. And I also felt as if it was okay to show my own feelings and my own compassion, because then I felt like I would come across more human to them, and then they would open up more to me. And not in a way that was disingenuous, but just in a way that, this is who I am, this is who you are. We both know what roles we're playing here, but we're both human, and we can be honest with each other in that way. So,
Adrian, you worked with this family for over a decade. How do you handle, did you even raise those rules about everything you say will be on the record? Did they understand it? Or you just disappeared you must have just become part of the family at some point.
There were so many different people over the course of that time, and then the real place where I think my consciousness of it moved to the front was with the children as they got older. I guess when they were really young, it didn't sort of seem like an issue, but as the book, it certainly wasn't something I thought would take 10 years. I think as it was just taking forever, then I was realizing that, they were growing up, and I just think there was so many things happening at the same time, but I definitely, had the basic rules. I felt the same way about the food issue always felt incredible to me, that you could take someone out to a really fancy lunch, like you could take somebody out to the Four Seasons or something if you were working for a publication. If I'm a freelancer, but if I had an assignment, yet I couldn't buy groceries for a family that I might be sleeping with for a week. At their house, you know what I mean? Because that was somehow giving them. So there were so many weird things like that, but I pretty much, because I funded some of the project by doing freelance pieces, so I had sort of those obligations, but they also were just rules that I didn't really question until I began to have my own transformation in the process of the work. And my feelings about it now have really changed a lot, and I still feel like I'm in a deep transition about trying to figure it out. And I'm teaching a class now, one of my students is here, called The Vulnerable Subject, which is ostensibly about reporting on so-called vulnerable populations, like people with mental health issues or people who suffered, natural disaster, whatever. But the whole point of the class is to get the writer to understand that they're as vulnerable as the subject, not saying, because people get very... I'm not saying it's the same thing as living in a homeless shelter or being the victim of a hurricane, but that if you don't recognize your own humanity and you don't allow for its breadth, you can really get yourself into a knot in very strange ways. And I think a certain kind of macho, objective type of parachute type journalism that many of us who became journalists sort of were assumed to admire has a very kind of problematic relationship to human relationships, not only with the journalist to the subject, but the journalist to their own health, to their own psychic stability, to their own vulnerabilities, and the editorial process. I find personally that for me during the years of that family's reporting, I was much more comfortable reporting than I was whenever I went into freelance magazines to be edited. I mean, I've actually found those environments much more stressful than the places that I reported on.
Right, yeah, I found the same thing. I did find the same thing, especially with children. There was a young woman in the film that I just finished who was 13 when I started, and she's now 21. And, by the time she's gone through her teenage years, she's almost like a daughter in some way, even though we have no formal relationship, but it gets very complicated. I can't say to her, no, I'm not going to buy you lunch, or anything you say will be on the record. Or even what about informed consent? Because as a child, her guardians, her parents, her mother said, yes, we agree to do this, but she never agreed to do it. So, as you sort of, it's a thicket. So you actually moved in with these families, Adrian? You were actually
I didn't move in, but there were periods of time I would stay over for a couple of days, or when some people moved upstate, I would stay with them, for the duration of the time I was there. It became impossible over time for me to sort of think straight if I stayed for too long, so when I would have to sort of focus on my notes or flesh them out, I just found my ability to stay focused increasingly difficult, and that inability was very important to understanding a certain kind of the psychological stressors, because I think the function of the high stress of poverty and the depression and all the things that are going on when you are constantly up against economic survival, it's just super stressful, as anyone knows who's having money trouble alone. That's not including trouble with shelter, hunger, noise pollution, all that. I couldn't focus, and so I would have to sort of keep leaving because I literally just couldn't think straight, or I would forget what I was trying to do. I would there would be days I remember, and I use this example, but I remember ending up at the emergency room after the end of a day that probably started the night before, and one of the children, we were waiting for hours and wanted to draw and asked me for my notepad, because I would often give the kids paper, and I pulled it out of my knapsack and I realized I hadn't pulled it out all day, because I was just in the day. And I don't know how I could have been a good reminder of what I'm up to when I myself sometimes lost track of what I was doing.
Yeah.
But it did help me on, later when people would say, well, she had a 9 o'clock appointment at the welfare office, why didn't she go? I started to understand, well, part of it is she's got 7,000 things going on all day long with 3 kids, no phone, and I'm just coming in for 8 hours. Maybe some of that is happening to her, and then I could ask her. And so in a strange way, my own struggle helped us understand one another.
Right. At a certain point, I wanted to sort of talk about the sort of collaboration. There's almost like an unwritten agreement when the person that you're covering in these stories begins to help you write the story. They begin to understand your process. Co-creation is a word that I guess we would use. Did any of you encounter sort of, I know you did, Adrian, because I read somewhere that you gave them a tape recorder at one point. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I wish it was a good idea, but it was really just a practical necessity that I was really tired and I had to go to my day job because at that time I was still working, and I just left it and said if something's going on, or maybe something that night I thought was going to happen, I can't remember, but I had to go and I just left it. And what became very interesting, and I imagine it's with texting now, if I were writing about young people now, I suspect texting would be a very rich way to communicate, but they would speak into the tape recorder, and to me, things that they didn't want to tell me to my face, or they interviewed one another pretending they were reporters, and that was really funny, what they thought it meant to be a reporter. And so they would imitate me or whatever, but I learned a lot by the questions they asked one another.
Andrea Elliot, did you, as you were working with Dasani's family, was there ever a point where you felt like they were sort of helping you try to understand their world?
Very much. So from the beginning, the shelter was off limits, and we ended up, the photographer and I, sneaking in through the back, but that was about 8 months in. So it was a necessity that they cooperate from the beginning with. So we gave them video cameras, and they did audio as well, and they would do these sort of video journals. And it's interesting because it's very similar to what you just described, because it's children, and so they would say things that they might not necessarily say to me directly, and they did pretend to be a reporter. It's just funny hearing you because I haven't had anybody else say that they did that. But I also the shelter is in a part of Fort Greene that is surrounded by housing projects. And so this was where I was immersed, and as a white lady who was coming from the New York Times, and I showed up in jeans, and I had a very different way of, I think, introducing myself than I would were I at City Hall. I would say my first name and that I'm at the New York Times, but I'm here to do a story about your lives, and just trying to disarm them a little bit from the beginning. And it didn't really work very well to have my notepad out. So much of the time, I think, in the beginning, and Ruth really went through this a lot, Ruth Fremson, the photographer, she couldn't take out, she didn't even join the project for the first 2 months. I couldn't have photography with me, but to have a camera out was just a whole other complication. So, but in the beginning, Chanel, Dasani's mother, just said, just stick with me, and eventually they're going to stop. Because what they saw when they saw me, the people in the neighborhood, were one of two things. I was either a social worker, which is somebody you cannot trust, or I was a do-gooder, which is someone you probably can trust and potentially hit up for some cash. So either one of the lay nuns or one of those nice volunteers at the school who comes by and works with the kids. So I was going to be one of those two people to their mind, or potentially I was, an undercover cop. But I don't think anybody thought that. But she was worried that she would be seen as a snitch, and she just said this. She kind of said to me, she knew intuitively. She's one of the more brilliant people I've met, Dasani's mother. She kind of told me what I already knew is from my years of reporting, which is like the more you hang out, the easier it'll get. She just knew that intuitively, and so we were there day in, day out. And I tell you all of this because the norms that I was used to, having a notepad out and stuff, really just couldn't work in this environment. And so what I ended up doing, and it became a lifesaver for me, and maybe I've leaned on it too much, is I have this thing called the LiveScribe pen, which records audio, and it timestamps it. So when you're writing, it's as if you write the word red right now, and then you stop writing, and you keep talking, and then you tap on the word red, it'll go back to that part of the recording, right? So I had this pen. It became my tape recorder, and it was sticking out of my pocket, and the kids called it my spy pen. And they would take it and they would use it as a microphone, and they would interview each other. And it was a little bit of a spy pen in the sense that I was never going to interview anyone with it without them knowing. But there were a lot of things that happened that I couldn't grab for instance, like a cop, I remember coming up to us at one point in a really belligerent manner. And I wanted to see this thing play out. and I would watch an exchange, and then he would take off. There are moments I have in the series that are captured on that pen, and the people are anonymous, not the subjects. They're totally, and they knew this was going on. So it was a very interesting way of immersing where I could really observe without completely outing myself, and it was an undercover project in a sense because we felt that very strongly, and rightly I think, that if the city knew what we were doing, they would have made everything go away. They would have transferred the family out, and they just would have shut it down. They would have shut the story down because what was happening inside that shelter was so appalling. And so it really needed to be a quiet thing, but the tools were very useful.
June, may I ask you, with the documentary film work, with this project you've been working on for so long, it's been my experience when a photographer joins me that they are much more welcome. There's a certain kind of energy that cameras generate. I don't know if this is changing now with so much social media and all that, but do you find it a mix, really depending? Or I've been amazed. There have been stories I've done where I'm, laboring to get people to talk to me for 3 months, and then I come out with a photographer, and the whole neighborhood, welcomes the photographer, and I'd be like, I should have known, just bring a camera. But what's your experience with
it
that?
sort of depends on the camera. So I actually also, at one point I gave one of the subjects a camera because she just wouldn't open up to us on camera. And we hoped that by giving her a camera and allowing her to narrate her own stories, she would do more. She actually never did, but she did give us a crucial piece of footage at one point where her mother was dying in a nursing home that had neglected her. And then it depended on the size of the camera. At one point, I brought a cameraman in who had like one of those big news cameras, and that totally intimidated them, and they couldn't, everybody shut down. But then when we used the DSLR, the camera like this young lady has here, a DSLR, that was fine, because that was sort of like you had a point and shoot, and they were willing to be okay with that. So there's sort of a range of experiences. Andrea, you also you worked on a video with your subjects. I wonder if David Simon would have done The Wire had this technology been available to him. But can you talk about what you did? And we're actually going to show a little piece of it.
So we did it after the story. After the story ran, we didn't want it to just end. We wanted to make sure that people kept talking about it and that it wasn't just a story and that nothing happened, that maybe would spur some change. So we gave teenagers in the community video cameras and let them tell the story themselves. And we went through a principal to do it, and she was very adamant that they tell their own, we want them to tell their own story, because people were really worried about, once again, that we would exploit the teenagers, et cetera. So they talked about what's good about their neighborhoods, what's bad about their neighborhoods, how they feel about their neighborhoods, to kind of continue this discussion going. And then we had a community forum where we showed the meeting, where we showed the video, and now other people are taking the video and showing it at their forum. So it kept the conversation going, and it let the community kind of tell their story in their own way too.
So it becomes sort of a way to continue the discussion. It's going to show. I can pull it up here. Hopefully it has not. Okay. There you go. Oh dear. What happened? Of course.
I love that idea.
These are test words.
Oh, yeah.
If it was a Mac, I'd know what to do,
Like,
but I'm a
did you have
PC
to-
illiterate person.
Yeah. So were there people-
So as reporters, when you watch The Wire, what are your, as reporters, as you watch that series, what thoughts do you have about how it was done? What stories were shown, what wasn't shown?
Are you talking, you said The Wire?
The Wire.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I just appreciated from the beginning the amount of work that The Wire required of viewers. It wasn't gonna, there were no cliff notes, it was an invitation to try to understand something complicated on both sides of the line, right? The sort of, it's just so interesting because it immediately creates this dichotomy where you've got the people who have the letter of the law behind them and all the power, and then this completely other set of folks who are governed by other laws And then you immediately begin to question from the get-go the morality of either set, in a sense. And you know, I just found it fascinating, and as a reporter, it made me, I think, just very appreciative of the ability to let a story slowly reveal itself.
Want to say something, and then I'll show this, or I'll show this, and then we can continue this?
show it.
Okay. Can somebody turn off the lights? We have all this light coming in from that. Oops. I'm not getting volume. What am I not doing? The what? Aha, okay. All right, I'll back it up as soon as I'm still not hearing you. It should be watching. Yeah, I did that one, it's all the way up. Is it plugged, where's the sound? There it is. All righty, first we have none, and then we have too much, okay.
H-I-J-K-L-M-N-O-P Q-R-S-T-U-V-W-X-Y-Z. Now I know my ABCs. Next time won't you sing with me? My neighborhood has people that I like. I like my sister and my other neighborhood and my other neighbors.
A lot of kids around here don't have places to go. It's hard to be out on the streets in some of these neighborhoods because there's a lot of traffic with cars and there's no play areas for them to be. So if they had somewhere to go to play, other little free programs for them to be enrolled into and to participate in, I think that would really help a lot.
So what do you think of your house?
It's fine.
And what do you think of your neighborhood?
It's fun too. What I like about my house, I like going to new houses.
A lot of kids, I mean, even smaller kids, I mean, we buy them things technology-wise, but a lot of kids aren't going out because neighborhoods aren't safe.
My mommy and daddy make me safe.
In my neighborhood in particular, there could be more policing or more things for children to do, activity-wise, recreational center-wise, and for smaller kids, maybe safer playgrounds to go to.
I need everybody in the circle. Campers. Good morning, campers. That's what I'm talking about. But I want you all to start off by thinking about a bad neighborhood and what a bad neighborhood looks like. What are those elements in your community that makes it a bad neighborhood? Work together as a team. In a minute, I'm going to ask for everybody to pick a spokesperson for their team, a leader, who's going to come up and explain what you all talked about and how you all came up with this rendition. Do your best.
Gun violence, what else do we see?
Explore what you think a bad community looks like, and those things that you don't like about your community, your neighborhood. I'm gonna look for color. We're gonna look for real life stories. We're gonna look for what you all are trying to say.
This right here is about the Baltimore riots. It's about people selling drugs on the corners, and the police don't do nothing about it. And when that's how some people die.
We got vacant houses here. We have kids on the swing set telling about what's going on when they're shooting. We have homeless people here, and we have drug dealers here.
I would like your impressions of what would make your community better. What does a good community look like? The things that are missing from your community. What a good community should look like to you. All right, let's draw that and see what you have to say.
I'm ready to make a camp. It's a church, because a lot of people go to church and show good things. It's a playground for like young kids to play.
So you got the playground. The people holding hands right here, the nice tree growing in the garden. You got another house right here, and you have somebody walking his dog, and that's it.
This is a basketball court. This is a community center, and this is some houses, and this is a school.
There's people picking up trash. There's people at the park swinging on the swings. This is a man watering fruit and a lady buying fruit.
Do you see this in your community now?
Yeah.
A lot of it, enough of it, or do you want more?
Want more?
You want more of it? Then say we want more of it.
Want more of it.
Okay, very good. Give him a camp clap, everybody.
This is the 2200 block of Jordan Hill Avenue. It's been like this for years.
I think it has something to do with the lack of attention our communities have. We fall on like the blind side. Like they don't pay attention to Baltimore. They don't pay attention to the issues that's going on. I can't say that they not starting to, because they is, but that's really the problem. Is we on the blind side. Well, we went to different communities such as Penn North, Drew Heights, Upton, and we just got people's opinions on their community. How do you feel about this? What can be done?
Yeah, I had gunshots probably like every day probably. Made me feel crazy because it's black on black crime, you feel me? White people set us up to live like this and we just feed into it, you feel me? Kids out here, they don't have nobody to lead them, and like, yeah, they just running wild. I can't teach somebody that what my mother teach me, because their mother not there to teach them that, you feel me?
What do you think's the hardest thing for you as a teenager living in your neighborhood?
Worrying about my safety, because it's a lot of bad people out here, and I live around a bad neighborhood. I recorded around the neighborhood, the litter and the vacant houses, and I got people inputs about youth violence.
Put something in the community for real, so kids can go there and enjoy themselves, so we don't gotta be out here in the streets running breakfast for real.
They don't give these kids a chance to live, you know what I mean? Every time you turn around, they're killing one another.
I don't like saying it. I don't like saying the trash, because people won't think that's you doing it, but it's really the people that's around you.
Yeah, that's good. This is what I gotta do since I can't read that well, and I gotta pass on all these years through school. So that's what I gotta do now. Yeah, it's like a flower. Like it's got different petals, but it's one flower. So I can't really. It's a lot going on in that one flower blooms, so you can't really, you feel me, mess with that one little part. It's the whole thing. Like you gotta be taking care of the whole flower. Soil, you gotta start from the soil, come up, and it's gonna grow. And when it blooms, it's gonna be beautiful, like a rose. So.
All that open space, that could be a big playground for kids to play on. So have something to do, or do something better instead of just letting it sit here and rot. Ain't no parent gonna send their kid to a place that got glass, bottles everywhere, junkies or places like that, because they don't want their kid to get hurt.
They not doing nothing with this community, nothing. That's why they burnt down and looted most of these stores. I change housing, that's what I change. All them vapes and stuff like that, I make all of them be renovated. All of them, all the 3-story houses, everything. I would make all of them restored. Because without a house, you can't really start nowhere.
Look at all that trash, all these vapes they could be using. Like they say, start building rec centers for people to have something to do. Because you know, after school or something like that, people don't have nothing to do. But the only thing that's on their mind is to act dumb or retarded.
You don't be having a lot of positive stuff to do, so you start to act out on different stuff. Like, if something ain't going on at home, you kind of screwing, you feel me, you get violent with somebody that you shouldn't be getting violent with.
You don't know what can happen in any second. So that's why I say you gotta live your life like it's the last day, you might would say.
I don't know, it's just hard. You gotta keep fighting. When stuff like this happen, like, we gotta fight the police and stuff like that. That's the only time I feel like we coming together. But when it's everyday stuff, it don't work. We beefing with each other, arguing, and different stuff like that.
So how can you make a difference?
I mean, I can speak up, but I'm only one man. Poverty, like, all that's in a mix of poverty, I guess. Some people starving, some people mothers and fathers on drugs, don't have no money. Like, I can't really tell you why another person did something that he wasn't supposed to do in society, but ain't nothing wrong with fighting for Baltimore. That's where I came from anyway. I love my city. I'll die for my city.
I don't like living here, but this is where I'm from, so I got to deal with the things that happen.
What do you have to do to survive?
A lot, like stay in school. I know that's part of survival. Try not to get killed before you like 21. We'll get locked up, so you're like 30. That's about it. Stay true to yourself and your family. And just try to be loved and take love. But like I was saying, if you've never been loved before, how you take love, you don't understand it. So you gotta really make a lot of decisions.
I woke him up that morning, got him and a friend of his ready for school because he had a friend sleep over. I was on the phone with my boyfriend, and one of his friends ran down to the house and said, Ananias got stabbed. Somebody else got on the phone hysterical. I don't even know who it was. I said, is my son gonna be okay? She said, I pray he does. I lost it.
I heard a yell down the hall. When I heard the yell down the hall, instantly we respond to what's going on to see, make sure everyone is okay. And it just so happened this time everybody wasn't okay. You saw Ananias in Mr. Witherspoon's arms, and you saw blood. I saw blood.
Got in the building, got upstairs. I saw Witherspoon, he was the first one I saw. And when I looked at him and his head dropped, I didn't know what to think, what to say. All I could say was, what happened to my baby? Where's my son? I don't want to be upset, I don't want to be angry, but my baby. And I look at it and I say, my innocent baby was taken from me.
It goes way deeper than just that one situation between two young men that could not resolve whatever issue they had. It goes to bigger parents, guardians, not being able to resolve their issues, the mental health issues that they have, the drug epidemic, the not knowing how to read, write, how to carry themselves as professionals or as individuals. Like, it goes way deeper than just those two young men. Coming to school, your hope is there. You get the feeling like, okay, I can be something, I can do something. But we can't take all of our kids home. We can't feed everyone every day. We can't provide the necessities of just love every day outside of school all the time.
If we're not teaching our children that you can go to college, if we're not teaching our children that you can be better than this, then they're not going to do it. Because they're not going to think that they can.
Some of them come to school just because I need to eat. That's the only reason why I'm here. I'm coming here so you can say, hey, how you doing? You can acknowledge that you see me, but when I leave you or when I leave school, what am I going to do? Because I'm going to have to go out here in this world with people. I have to worry about somebody who's going to shoot me, take me down. I might be robbing somebody because I need some money. I might start selling drugs because I need some money. So you have kids that say they want to be in jail, or I don't care if I go to jail because ain't nothing else out here for me. I don't care if I die. There's nothing out here for me. So these are the type of things that you got to deal with on a daily basis as an adult. When you see hopelessness just running loose.
I don't know his home life. But I get to a place in my mind where I'm like, if a young person, a child, gets to a point where they can do something like this, something is missing.
Most of our kids are losing this battle because of the things that are surrounded by them where you don't see hope. They don't see hope to do anything different than what they're accustomed to doing.
Truthfully, it starts with us adults learning how to raise our children and raising them right. Because it hurts me to my heart that it is my generation's children that are doing this.
It's tragic to say that it took a young man to lose his life for people to understand that we're in this fight every day. Every day, we go to work every day and we have to deal with these type of issues. Most of the kids around the world are dealing with social, economic, traumatic experiences, whether they're black, white, Mexican, Latino, it doesn't matter. They all are dealing with some type of things. It's just less fortunate that most times some African Americans are not given the same opportunity or the same resources that others are. But sometimes that doesn't stop us if I'm trying to help when we can. Because I know I help as much as I can with children I don't know, children that I don't see, kids I see outside, whatever. Like, it's just about being who I am as a man, who I am as a person, to be like, there's a better option to this.
I look at Baltimore, we have so much talent here, be it artists, not just singing and rapping, but people that draw, people that can build things, we have speakers. I've met so many people that have been locked up, and I'm like, you can sing, you can dance, you can draw, you can do this. Why are you here? Why is this not out here on these streets being used? Because nobody told them that they could or how they could. I used to be proud of my city, and I still am. But we gotta get it together.
These were all folks that you'd interviewed for the series that you went back?
Well, after the series.
After the series. Yeah, I feel like as reporters, we've been since 1892 when Jacob Riis first did Children of the Poor, to Alex Kotlowitz, There Are No Children Here in 1992, to The Random Family, to Invisible Children, to Collateral Damage. We keep telling these stories over and over again. What will it take to make a difference? Or, I mean, like we look at The Wire and we're all teaching The Wire and that's great, but I guess maybe that's a question for the audience more than us, since we're the ones that keep telling the stories. But I throw it out as I want to get into the questions from the audience. I'm throwing it out there. I'd like to hear some answers from you guys on this, besides, what is it about fiction that seems to bring these stories, that seems to make it more real for students? I'm not sure. I think as reporters, we were all talking earlier about the question of grappling with the question of whether we exploit our character, we're not exploiting them, but to the degree to which they get exploited or get used as political pawns. And how have each of you tried to mitigate that, deal with it? I'm sorry, I'm sort of affected by this. I see you're all got tears in your eyes. Maybe this isn't a good time. Let's do the questions from the audience. We're all getting ready to cry up here.
Could I just say one thing about the connection to The Wire? Like, when I just think, you're working on this HIV/AIDS documentary. You wrote about homelessness. I wrote in large part about a family. You're talking about public health, and one setting is a preschool. And I feel like The Wire, I think, it's such an extraordinary piece of work. I think for me, especially in terms of its dimensionality, that all the systemic pieces are operating while the characters are deeply developed. But the one thing that I think is connected to like this group of women is there's the presentation of women and children in The Wire, I think, is very understated, because most poor communities are just filled with women and children, and so many men are incarcerated. So what's interesting is about the narrative power in American culture right now, it's still very much a very male-dominated landscape, violence-driven, criminally focused. And yet the stories we're talking about are really about and I understand there's an intersection. It's not, but it's a very interesting and very serious narrative omission, I think. It's not total, but I think it's quite interesting,
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sherry Parks from the University of Maryland, and I live outside Baltimore. And it was interesting that you mentioned the corner and that you just mentioned women, because it was actually in the corner where he actually talked much more about the lives of women, and actually it's my favorite. I know I'm in a room of Wire fans, but because, and I've told him this, because of the day-to-day lives of women. And I just wanted to speak to the point that June just mentioned about the difference between, I'm an American Studies professor, between journalism and narrative. And Simon, I've interviewed him 4 times on NPR and on stage, and been on panels with him. And we just did an event, which I'll tell people about in the afternoon, that he was a part of. And he talked about his transition from the Sun into doing fiction. And one of the reasons he did it was so he could have, he wouldn't say it this way because he rankles when you say he did it to have an effect, but he wanted to be able to tell the story more fully. And I'm a fan of print journalism. I spent a lot of time as a young print journalist. But I do think that when we move into the aesthetic realm, and earlier this morning people talked about having parasocial relationships with the characters, that's really hard to do with the holy grail of journalism about objectivity, which actually I don't believe in. And I'm okay.
I don't think any of us do either.
Good, yeah, good. I don't think you can do immersion journalism and be objective in that way, but it's still, you're supposed to strain for it in a way that I think in fiction you don't have to. He tells the story in a way that he, and I'm paraphrasing him at this point, feels is in some way truer than the journalism that he wrote as a journalist. So it's not really a question, it's more of a statement.
Thank you. The panel is on the journalism aspect, and in the series you had the quotes with H.L. Mencken, and Simon and the other writers were part of the newsroom. I'm just curious as to your view of how did he get it right. We had a quote earlier saying a longshoreman, if you got it right, he'd know that did the job. I'm curious as to what y'all think as far as his portrayal of the newsroom, the politics within the newsroom, and maybe if there's a story you could share with regards to how politics have played out in the newsrooms that y'all have worked in?
Andrea, since it's sort of your newsroom that's portrayed here, can you walk this very fine line?
Well, I came in 2001 and David Simon had already left. And so the newsroom I saw that he portrayed was a newsroom to me that was there before I was there, if that made sense. So the newsroom portrayal the newsroom that was portrayed didn't feel like the newsroom I was in at the time. And I think it dated back historically to when new editors came in and there was tension between the old, people that were there before and the new editors that came in. And I think that's where that stemmed from, because although it was fiction, he based a lot of, and I've never talked to David Simon about this, but from what I've read and learned, he based a lot of it based on what he experienced. So I think that newsroom that he portrayed was based on that.
I'm just curious, to what extent is he, mythologized at all in today's Sun's newsroom? And
like, you mean, does he know anything about today's newsroom?
No, is his legend, how does it, is he legendary there? I
mean, yeah, I think he was known as he was a great police reporter,
right,
and a nice writer, but he's not shy about his criticism of the paper either. Right. And sometimes reporters get frustrated because they'll call the police reporters and, criticize the way they're doing certain things. I've heard them say that. So there's some of that as well.
I mean, my own perception, although I'm the moderator, I guess, I found it a little more, it was fiction, so there were clear good guys and bad guys, and I don't think any newsroom is like that, really. I think we're all striving for something approximating fairness, even if it's not objective truth. There is no objective truth, but we do strive for fairness. At least every editor I've ever worked for has. I think Spotlight gets it closer, the movie that just won Best Picture gets it closer to what the newsrooms I've worked in. Anyway. Yeah.
Somewhat to follow up on that, but one element that is certainly brought up in The Wire is that immersion journalism is expensive and is not something that necessarily yields paper sales, and it doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on the bottom line of commercial enterprises, which is what journalism is in America for the most part. So I'm just curious if you can speak at all to the tension of that. If you're working, obviously the Times is potentially above the market to some degree, but every newspaper has to consider this, and to what degree is this long-form immersion possible or really inhibited, and what are the goals that you see the institutions that you're working for trying to achieve by investing the time and money into these projects?
I would just love to quickly answer that. In this age of Twitter and Instagram, I think there's this notion that people have a shorter attention span and that there's less of an appetite for long form. And I feel like there's a pretty strong track record that would argue against that in just the metrics you can see with the projects that run. I'm just speaking about my newspaper, but with Invisible Child, we had the most number of reader comments posted of any story in our history. It was the longest story that the paper had ever run. The highest number, there were a bunch of interesting metrics. Highest number of reader comments posted. And this is an interesting age because we can watch what our readers are doing in real time in ways that we couldn't with just the dead tree. And so I was watching as someone in the newsroom was showing me that we had broken a record in terms of the average length of readers staying in one story. Up until Invisible Child, it was 2 minutes, and this doesn't sound like much because it would take a lot longer to read it, but it went to 7 minutes. With the series, the average time that readers were staying in that, which was kind of stunning, given it was so long. You would think they'd ditch it more quickly. So there were a bunch of things that series showed us about the appetite, the interest, and there have been a bunch of other projects that have done the same thing, but we can really measure it now. And I just think that this idea that people, maybe it's because we're in such a fast world, all of a sudden there's so much information coming at us that when we have a chance to pause and read Random Family and go really, really, really deep, it's an escape in a sense from all of that. It's like they work, I think, in tandem.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think it's what can help newspapers stand out with the field so crowded now and everybody covering the daily stuff. When you have the long form, when you have the good investigations, I think that's what makes us stand out and what people can go to for newspapers when they want something different. Now, I would say, maybe not for the Times because you're huge, but it's harder to do now. I mean, when I started at the Sun in 2001, there were 400 something people in the newsroom. Now there's like just above 100. So when I was doing this, I mean, I spent a year on it, but they didn't let me off of my beat. And it was when I covered health and medicine. It was when the health exchanges were starting. The health exchange in Maryland blew up. It was a disaster. So I was covering that and then So it's harder to do, but I do think, as you said, that people do want to read good stories and they do want to read good investigations. And you can measure it now with web hits, and which is good because then you have the evidence that, yeah, this is what people want.
May I just ask, because I know there are a number of academics in the audience, one thing that I do feel, and I say this fully as a participant who directly attempted to do this, to try to make otherwise stories that people resist or are less inclined toward to be engaging enough where they stay with it, is I worry about the entertainment like why suffering now has to be entertaining enough for you to bother with as a viewer or a reader. And I think a lot about my role in that. And like I wonder, like if you were in medical school, if every class had to be entertaining for you to bother to learn it. Do you know what I mean? Like what is this all leading toward in a way I really wonder, because it sounds like a lot of you are using The Wire in your classes, and I get it on one level, but another part of me feels very like, I don't know. I feel like worried about that part. Because I think one of the biggest privileges of privilege, like one of the many privileges of having privilege, is you get to be interested in your life more often, because one of the greatest struggles of poverty is boredom, right? And the mind-boggling twists that having inactivity, as you could hear in that video, just people wanting a playground. I mean, it's not like very complicated. So I just wonder about that level of people that aren't even suffering from this, many people having to be engaged at a high level to be bothering with it at all. You know, that worries me.
Yeah. How do you choose your subjects? Or how do you choose what you're going to write about? Maybe that's related to privilege because you're at a certain place in your careers that you can choose, but what makes a good, what are you drawn to write about?
I just want to say it's fun to answer that question in the context of an academic conference, because I think one of the longstanding tensions between academics and journalists has to do very much with that question, the gestation, the launch of a project. I mean, academics tend to go in pursuit of something pretty concrete from the outset, and of course then they have their findings. You'd argue that journalists do the same, but what I wind up doing most of the time is I go in just blind. I'm lost, I'm a mess, it's chaotic, I'm searching, I'm talking to people, and I think I know I know what the topic is, but I don't know what the story is within this topic heading. And I think that that's a really important thing to protect in our work, because of course we don't know what the story is. You don't know until you're in these worlds. How you choose a subject, for me, because I'm immersing, this began with my work on Islam, has to do with something sort of selfish in a sense. If I'm going to spend a lot of time with someone, I want it to feel, I kind of want it to be fun in a way, even if it's desperately sad. I'm looking for spark. I'm looking for somebody who has a sense of humor, because I think those kinds of personalities, often things happen around them, and it's not, I don't know that I have a necessary bias towards an extrovert versus an introvert, but I'm looking for texture and, like the kind of person that I would want to write about, because if if I want to write about them, people will be more likely to want to read about them. But it's not more specific than that, you know. And I actually wound up, you know, having this very clear idea based on the metrics of homelessness, of, you know, the perfect family would be a working mom, part-time worker with no benefits, of course, stuck in the shelter system with 2 children, because that's the average, having only been there for a year. They're a blended family. She's probably part Hispanic. Her kids are different things. I wound up with a completely different family because at the end of the day, it became much more about finding a kid who could express herself, and ultimately what she was expressing was a universal enough experience that it applied to that other perfect family. It's just that the portal was different, you know. So I try to guard against too much, you know, kind of like going in with a predetermined set of boxes to check, because it never works out that way for me.
Andrea,
I would agree. I think it's always something totally different than you expected the story to be. And I do the same thing. I kind of just go in and talk to as many people as I can, and it's usually the ones, you know, that open up to you the most and tell the most compelling story that I end up using.
Adrian?
I agree, and I also think I don't always know what drew me to the story until much later, after the story's actually been written. I sort of think, oh, I think that's why there's a lot of unconscious instinct, I think, that's operating.
I'm one of the academics who uses materials, and Ms. LeBlanc, I use your book. I assign it before my clinic goes into the Bronx to actually represent people in criminal court. They have to read the book, and we spend an entire 2-hour seminar talking about the book.
Thank you.
If people haven't read Random Family, it's incredible. Going to this issue about entertainment, you know, on the one hand, you know, I teach in a law school. If you've read case books, they're not entertaining. The students we get nowadays, for whatever reason, and we know the reasons, are addicted to screens, and they need to be entertained at all points and at all moments. So, you know, it's really old-fashioned, but it's a little song, a little dance, a little salsa down your pants in order to get people excited in a classroom. And that's, you know, it's really almost that simple. But great work like Random Family and The Wire is entertaining enough. I show excerpts of The Wire, some of it very dark, but, and not entertaining in a, you know, in a usual sense. The students really do get engaged. They have to see the relevance. They have to see the connection between what you're delivering to them and what they're going to be able to do with it. And, you know, a law school, like a med school, ultimately, in a way, is a trade school.
Yeah.
So if they see the relationship between the material you're giving them and what they're going to do with it, it generally works. I mean, I find it works. So.
Thank you. I'm sorry. We're running out of time, and I'd like to get, I know there's 2 more questions. I wonder, can each of you just ask your question, and then we'll answer both of them? If you could just.
So I admire all 4 of you. Thank you so much for coming. I was really struck listening to what your lives were like doing this work. You mentioned you were covering a beat and you had a day job. And I always think it's interesting when these like really beautiful, thoughtful pieces come out there and then they're criticized in academic environments. But I would love to hear about the day-to-day, like practical realities of how you endured some of these projects while holding a job.
You're going to have to come up
and
afterwards.
While doing everything else. I'd love to hear about like your practical kind of journeys.
Okay, and what is your question, Sarah? We'll try to do both of them in like 3 minutes. Go ahead.
And then I'm another one of those academics, but from a different disciplinary perspective. So I'm a cultural studies academic. And actually, I wanted to bring up the notion of fascination because you guys brought it up a lot. I think a lot of us are not just interested in using that as a vehicle to entertain students, but are actually fascinated with it as a genre. I actually am also fascinated with your genre, with ethnography and immersive journalism. So I write about that from time to time in the same way you might write about your own subjects. And I'm wondering if that helps you or if you have any thoughts about that kind of approach. Thanks.
Okay, anybody want to take both of those, day-to-day and writing about?
I can take the first.
Okay.
I was stressed out.
I think we all agreed on this.
And I'm not the most organized person, so I had to learn to become more organized. And I found that they used to tell you in J school, don't tape your notes, don't tape your interviews, because if the tape recorder fails, you're in trouble. I learned to tape everything because I didn't know when I was going to get to come back to it, and I might get away from the story for 2 weeks, and then you forget nuances. Right. So I was able to go back and transcribe the tape and remember, oh, I forgot they said that. That's a good quote. So that helped a lot too. And then you said something about being on the subway and and just writing down what you thought most about that. So I started doing that. I had a good editor that taught me a lot of these tips. So going back right away and put it in your notebook and trying to, pick out good quotes and putting them in a file so that when you come back, you remember stuff, so it helps balance it. But I think the hardest part is, I don't know for you, but at the very end, when you're going through the final editing and you're paranoid there's going to be a mistake and you're trying to get it all together, I think that's the most stressful part. And I don't think I slept the night before.
And you were working your beat the whole time you were doing this.
Yeah, so I was working.
That is just,
I was working at most, I should step back. So I was working at most of the time. I think the last few months, they let me devote the entire time to it. But yeah, it was stressful for a while. But it was worth it because I became so interested in the subject and in the people that I wanted to do it. So, but it was hard sometimes.
I'll just say one quick thing about fascination and entertainment, just trying to tie in a couple different strands, because I share Adrian's thought about sort of reservation slightly about the idea that, this stuff has to be entertaining for viewers, readers, consumers.
Or not
to
hopeless,
buy in.
I think. I got that a lot. You have to leave people some hope.
Just the kind of, there's something that doesn't sit right about that word in relation to the subject. And so I would just remove that word. I know we're talking about entertainment, it's The Wire, but, yes, we want to be fascinated. We want to be, I would use a different word that starts with an E, engrossed. I think that the way that your book begins with Jessica in getting ready for the day and the chances that the ghetto brings, right? It just immediately makes you want, it makes you invest in the story, right? It's engrossing. So is that entertainment? Maybe you could call it entertainment. I would call it fabulous narrative that makes somebody want to learn more and take the journey and stick with it. And what happens on the other end, the policymakers can decide, but I just think that we have to keep striving to tell these stories as richly and beautifully as we can, and not be shy about that, because that's what gets them noticed. That's what keeps them alive.
Adrian, parting words, and then we have to close it. Any parting words from you on fascination and culture?
I want to feel as hopeful as Andrea again. I don't right now, but maybe I will. And I guess the practical consequences of my experience led me to my current project, which is on stand-up comedy. So I went into a real depression after the book. I was transformed by the experience in a lot of, ultimately probably good ways, a lot of bad ones. Developed a lot of bad health habits, smoking, all kinds of stuff happened. But so comedy isn't the healthiest resolution to that, but I'm a much happier person. So anyway.
Okay. Thank you all three. We look forward to reading your work in the future.